Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar again. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21 and Enfield Climate Action Forum. And this is one of the many webinars we do. And we're going to interview Maggie Brookes again, or Maggie Brookes, as some of us know her as. We interviewed her before because she has written her first novel, or she did write her first novel, which was called The Prisoner's Wife. And it was a really good novel. And I gather it's been very, very successful. She's now written her second novel, and we're going to talk to her about that. But first of all, just for those people who aren't sure who you are, and I'm sure that's not many locally, perhaps you could tell us, you've been both a TV producer, haven't you, and also a university lecturer.
Yes, I have. Thank you very much, Francis, and thank you for having me here today. Yes, I did an English degree in Cardiff and then became a newspaper reporter in Devon, a television documentary producer, and it was there that I discovered my interest in history. I think it had been quite badly taught at school. We just had to learn the parts of Forster's Education Act and so on. And I discovered that history was about people and about the way that people work and the way that they think, and that through history a lot of things have stayed the same. People have stayed the same, and unfortunately scenarios repeat themselves and repeat themselves. And that's what's really interested me in writing these two novels. The Prisoner's Wife, set in the Second World War, the new one, Acts of Love and War, set in the Spanish Civil War, and finding ourselves now with the terrible situation in Ukraine. I'm seeing echoes all the time of both of those.
Say that you were interested in history and so on, but we've known you first of all because of your passion for poetry, and for us that's how we got to know you. You're a member of a local poetry group, aren't you? And for you that's equally important as writing novels.
Well, that's right. After I'd left the BBC, I went into Middlesex University and taught there in their creative writing department for 30 years, doing various managerial roles as well. And at that time, I rediscovered my first love of poetry and have actually had 6 poetry collections published under my married name, which is Maggie Brookes. And then when the first novel was published, it was quite funny, really. We were in a meeting with the marketing people, and they were about to go to the States to sell the book. And I said, is my surname of Butt going to be a problem in the States? And they said, oh, thank God you've raised that. So I cast about. I was trying to find a lovely name like, a Marilyn Monroe writing name, and couldn't come up with anything good enough. So I thought, well, my maiden name was Brookes, and I answered to Maggie Brookes for quite a long time. So I think I would continue to answer to that if anybody called me by that name. So that's how that came about.
So what took you such a time to write your first novel? I mean, you didn't wait as long as Mary Wesley did, who I think started in her 60s or 70s, but you didn't start straight away, did you?
I think Mary Wesley was 76 when she published her first novel, which is and then had 10 bestsellers, I think, one a year. So hope for everybody. Well, I had written novels. I had written novels since I was all through my teens and my 20s. I filled notebooks with stories and poems. I wrote the first full-length novel I wrote, I think I was about 19 or 20. But I never managed to find a publisher for any of them. I have a number of unpublished novels under the bed, and perhaps that's the best place for them. And so it wasn't until I discovered the story of The Prisoner's Wife, or it was given to me. And I wrote it, first of all, as a long poem, and it was published as a long poem. And then I thought, do you know what? That was such a good story. I would really like to try and get that out to a wider audience. And of course, poetry, while I love poetry, it doesn't have a massive audience. Fiction is still much more popular in this country. So so when the story of Acts of Love and War was also fell into my lap, I knew that had to also be a novel rather than poetry.
Under the Bed sounds like it would be the title of your next novel, which
Perhaps
would
it's my
require.
memoir. Perhaps
Oh,
it's my
yeah, your
memoir.
memoir. That would be really that would be very revealing. Right, it's soon. I mean, okay, we talked about The Prisoner's Wife in the last webinar, so we won't go into that, except for the themes that are in both novels. You've now written this second book, Acts of Love and War, and just for people listening, without giving too much away, what is the focus of this book?
Well, this book, perhaps I should tell you how it came about. No, let me first of all tell you, it's the story of Lucy, an English girl who goes into the horrors and dangers of the Spanish Civil War to bring back the two men that she loves. But also with another aim. She has discovered that the Quakers are running humanitarian aid to refugee children, and she goes out to help with that. And this story was, as I say, given to me in the middle of Brexit. And actually in January 2020, I was having lunch with Professor Farah Mendelssohn, who I knew to be an expert on the English civil wars. And as we were in the middle of Brexit, I said to her, I would like to write about divided nations. And could she give any suggestions to me about the English civil wars? And she said, no, but I can give you my PhD thesis to read. And her PhD thesis was about the extraordinary aid given by the Quakers to refugee children and others through the Spanish Civil War. And as soon as I had read that, I was hooked. I knew that this was a story that I really wanted to tell.
So had you sort of known about the Spanish Civil War before, or was it just that suggestion, that lunch or dinner that you had that resulted in you having that interest? And did you then rush to read Homage to Catalonia and George Orwell?
I did all of those things. You're quite right. I knew very, very little about the Spanish Civil War. I'd read Homage to Catalonia, I'd read For Whom the Bell Tolls, I'd read Laurie Lee. I had that kind of vague background, but I was a complete novice. I had to start with basic information about the Spanish Civil War, and oh my gosh, was it complicated. I had a map, a great big map of Spain on my study wall. I also had I unrolled plain wallpaper and I made a timeline in which all the main events of the Spanish Civil War were. And then I worked out where my characters would be. As I figured out who the characters were, I worked out where the characters would be at all the different points in the Spanish Civil War. So it was quite in a way, logical, mathematical exercise. And then, of course, we're in early 2020 and there's a virus making its way from China to Italy, first of all, and then coming closer to the UK. So I had very little time to rush to the libraries, the main libraries, particularly, of course, in this case, the Friends Meeting House Library, the Quaker Library in London, and gather up books and read as much as I could before we were locked down.
Then you obviously got very much involved in it, but what gives it added poignancy now is the Ukraine situation, doesn't it? We have two situations, not totally similar, but there are similarities. And when you look at the Ukraine situation, it must make you think of what happened back in the 1930s.
Yes, indeed. When we first began to see and read about Ukraine, and then I was thinking that I've at this point spent 2 years writing a novel in which an aggressor, a very highly armed aggressor, takes on a legally, democratically elected government and invades a country with the help of people who are, doing so also illegally. Young men and women rush to join international brigades. Women and children are loaded onto trains to escape the indiscriminate bombing. The aid agencies come in to help those who are displaced by the horrors of war. And all of those things were part of what happened in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, in the Spanish Civil War, General Franco attacked the democratically elected government and had the help of Hitler in Germany and Mussolini in Italy, quite illegally, because there was a non-intervention pact which all the countries of Europe had signed. And as a result of that, Britain and France didn't go in to help the democratically elected government, Republican government in Spain. So, I saw, yes, so many terrible echoes of what I'd been writing about for the last 2 years.
I mean, there are echoes clearly in that, and you've given the historical context in which you wrote the book. But that book and your previous book is also about relationships in extreme situations. And that seems to be a theme that also really interests you. Is that right?
It is. I think once you start to develop a character, they become real to you. And all of us real people seek the love of other human beings. I think that it seems to me completely understandable and obvious that there would also be love stories woven into these stories of war. I'm very interested in the best and worst of human beings, and war seems to bring out the best and worst of human beings. So in this case, terrible stories that the two brothers who Lucy goes to bring back from the war, one of them has volunteered for the international brigades, and the other is a journalist writing on Franco's side because he is a Catholic. And both of them are in love with her, and she thinks that she loves them equally, but does she? Will she choose one over the other?
Don't give that away. Don't give that.
I'm not going to give that away. I'm not going to give that away. But I think I want to write about love in many of its forms, actually, because Lucy's love for humanity generally is what leads her to undertake this fantastic work with the refugees. The love of her friends, the friends that she makes there, are what supports her through these terrible experiences, and the love of the two boys, the two brothers, sustains her and perhaps carries the reader with them to find out what's going to happen.
Oh, that with the two boys, with Jamie and Tommy, their love is for Lucy, but their love is also for their ideologies, their commitment, their passion. And certainly with Tommy, that becomes the dominant factor. And in a way, their love shows both all the complexity, the depth, and the shallowness at the same time.
I think that's right. I mean, when I started to think about creating two brothers, I knew they had to be very different from one another. And yet what came out was the kind of obsessive nature of their commitment to their particular cause, in Tom's case to the Republican side, and in Jamie's case to the Catholic Church. And so they had those two things. Well, and the third thing, which was their passion, both of them, for Lucy, and their desire to win her over to themselves. So those were the things that they had in common.
And Lucy as well. I mean, love is never simple and it's never entirely pure. And in a way, her love was driven in a way by her, not rejection, but by the way her father treated her. Her father adopted Tommy and Jamie in a way, because their father was killed saving his life. And as a result, he got the two sons he always wanted. And Lucy always felt that, she wasn't quite valued in the way that they were. So her love, in a way, was almost a longing, wasn't it? A sort of selfish longing. I think she says in one point in your book, or you say, you can never be completely miserable when you're doing something for someone else. So her compassion is partly about an emptiness in herself, isn't it?
Absolutely. She that thing that you've quoted actually was something my mum used to say, and I was very happy when that sort of fitted into the book. She is definitely, she decides she hasn't got the love of her father, and she needs to win the love of everybody else that she comes into contact with, whether that's the children that she's teaching in the primary school in Hertfordshire before she leaves, the people that she comes into contact with in Spain, and obviously the two boys from next door.
And then, of course, to make up for that, it's not just Tommy and Jamie. She finds another family. She has to find another family. And it's through the Quakers, it's through people like Margarita and Edna, and the people she met, that they came out as heroes in a way, because they put the pieces together, the devastation that was being caused. But you felt with her, with Lucy, and she also sort of almost adopted a daughter, Concha, didn't she? You found with Lucy, she was desperately also looking for another family.
I think that's absolutely right, and she finds it in this group of, well, extraordinary, dedicated, selfless, and courageous people who were real people, who decided that they were not professionals in the way that we have professional aid workers now. These were people like Francesca Wilson, who was a teacher, like Canty Cooper, who was a sculptor, who just decided to go and help, and up sticks, took themselves off to Spain and threw themselves into this extraordinary work. And as you say, they become Lucy's real family. And people ask me sometimes if I'm a Quaker, and I'm not, although I have huge admiration for the Quakers. And it seems to me that, and in fact, the British and American Quakers were given the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 for the compassionate work that they did for the people who were suffering, both in the Second World War and particularly in the Spanish Civil War. And the Nobel Peace Prize was awarded for people who, for the people who gave aid from the nameless to the nameless. But of course, my research showed they were not nameless. They were Francesca and Alfred and Norma and Canty and a whole host of other people, actually a small host of other people, who just took themselves off and did it.
But you also explore love in terms of a threesome. You've got Tommy, you've got Jamie, you've got Lucy. Were you trying to say something about, love can be for more than one person? Because their love was, it was complex, it was romantic, it was sexual in both cases. It's one woman loving two people equally. So were you trying to explore love in that sense as well?
Well, I suppose I was, but I didn't set out to do that. I set out to make characters who were as real as I could make them, and by setting up these two people who she goes to Spain, I wanted to show both sides of the Spanish Civil War. I wanted to show the fake news that was coming out of one side. I wanted to show the complexity of a war situation, and in so doing, it just felt right to me that she should have grown up with these two boys, who are very different from one another, and so she loves them in a different way. And it seemed to me, as one might love one's children equally, but in a different way. It's not something I've had personal experience of, but it seems to me entirely possible.
Yeah, I mean, it seems it's not just a sexual and romantic thing. I got the feeling when I was reading your book that you were talking about something even beyond that, a sort of metaphysical form of love. And that sort of came out of it to me. I don't know if you were trying to show that.
I think I was trying to explore love in the many forms that it takes. So I think that what you find there is there.
What you find in a novel is what you find in the novel, right? It may not be what you say, but I mean, and that's a great thing about novels, isn't it? It allows people to find their own story, which is then about as much about their lives as it is about the story they read.
Absolutely. I think that's right. I think we latch on to certain elements, don't we? And identify with certain elements, and those become very important to us. So I think that is part of the joy of fiction.
But you know that the element we talked about earlier, that you were looking at love in extreme situations, you do say again in the book, the nearness of death forced you into a new appreciation of life and a new level of love. Is it because you could explore love in those extreme situations forensically in a way that you probably can't if you were writing a Mills and Boon novel?
I just think it's true that when we are in extremis, everything is magnified. And so, you know, you talk to people about the Second World War, you talk to people about their experiences of war, and part of what they talk about is always the people they left behind, or the people they were trying to live for, to return to. So I think it is just this kind of magnification of emotion that happens under these terribly extreme situations.
But it's also about bonding as well, isn't it? Because Tommy particularly, you know, is in love with Lucy, but he's also very loyal to his comrades. And he wants to go back always, not because of the call so much, but because he doesn't want to let his comrades down. And that bonding is almost as strong as the love he has for Lucy. And I think you bring that out. And is that something you were aware of when you were writing it?
Well, I don't want to give too much of the plot away, but I think that yes, you know, when you read things like Homage to Catalonia or Band of Brothers, you know, my dad's experience during the Second World War, the closeness that he retained for the whole of his life with the men who he was in that situation with. You know, in life and death situations, you humans do develop tight connections with the people that they are placed with, and have a loyalty to them that is that is unshakable, really. So I think, you know, that's another aspect of love, isn't it? The men or particularly men in the 1930s might not have called it love, but it is love. It is love for those who you are in this terrible situation with.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is love in that situation, and that's why they don't want to let people down, because they've seen their comrades die, and they feel guilty about that as well. Jamie's quite interesting. He's different, isn't he? I mean, he has a absolute conviction that Franco is going to be a defender of the faith. He had a very strong Catholic father. He wanted to follow him and be loyal to his faith. But in the end, he came around to suddenly realize.
Oh, don't give it away.
Okay, I won't give it away, but I'll ask you, did you use Jamie to get a bit of your own political views over?
Jamie was very difficult to write because I wanted to show both sides. And my sympathies personally were very much with the Republicans. So I had to ensure that Jamie was likable, lovable, that you had some connection with Jamie, because otherwise the book is skewed from the start, and you don't know which way to turn. So Jamie had to be the most loyal, the most giving, the most loving, the most handsome of the two brothers, in order to make it clear how Lucy can love him as well as Tom. So Jamie was the one that I had to work at most hard in order to show this religious feeling. And there were people who were who said they were absolutely not fascists, but because at the beginning of the Civil War, when Franco invaded, there was a mob which went on the rampage, and there were terrible, horrific murders of Catholic priests and nuns and monks. So you can imagine that somebody who had been brought up in the Catholic faith would be particularly appalled and feel that they had to support Franco, even if they weren't a fascist. So that was how I had to work with Jamie to ensure that his view was believable, understandable, sympathizable with.
Yeah, I mean, I could see when I was reading it that he was the most difficult character to sort of carve out, because, he started in the belief that he had, and things happened in his life. And I don't want to go into the story, but it made some big changes, bigger ones probably than his brother. But one of the overall themes to me that comes out of it and shouts loud and clear is that war is horrible. I mean, you say that again and again and again. War is horrible. People do terrible things. It's tragic. But in that, there is compassion. There are people who can, despite the tragedy of war, care for people and want to do something to make the world better, even though they're doing it in the most difficult circumstances. And that, I think, is a really clear message. And I'm sure that's probably a message you wanted to get out.
I think it absolutely was. I mean, my own parents, my father was in the army and was a prisoner of war. My mum was a nurse during the Second World War. So sort of firsthand in my family, the horrors of war, the ghastliness of war, what was there. My mother nursed young men who died in the most horrific burns, for example. And so I knew, and she was a pacifist, and I inherited that passion, that anti-war passion from her. And so I knew that I wanted to write about the horrors of war, in order to try to ensure that people understand why we must build bridges and work together in order for these things not to happen, if possible. And we see the horror of it in Ukraine. The Spanish Civil War was particularly brutal and ghastly, and the compassion that other human beings. I almost feel there's like two races of humans: those that can do these horrific, ghastly things to each other, and those who selflessly go out to help. They seem to me like not the same, certainly not the same tribe, perhaps not the same race at all. And the work that the Quakers and other aid agencies did in the Spanish Civil War, the work that we see, Save the Children, UNICEF, the UN doing in Ukraine and in Poland and Moldova now, it is extraordinary. They are just amazing, amazing people, and I wanted to celebrate them as well as say.
Yeah, I mean, that message is important in a time now, which is probably more dangerous than we've ever known, with nuclear proliferation, with the conflicts in the world, with climate change and so on. That message that you got over about the Quakers and others who were compassionate, that's really an important message, isn't it? Because it gives us a seed of hope.
I think it does, and I think it's what we have to hang on to, is the essential goodness of a lot of people, and when they see others in distress, they are more likely to go and help than not.
Okay, you've written 2 books. When's the next one, and what is it?
Well, I don't know for sure yet. I want there to be another one. I was writing this Acts of Love and War all through lockdown, and that was fantastic to me, because it gave me somewhere to go to in my head when we couldn't go anywhere physically. The next book, in a way, I would like to not write about war, but I think my publisher probably wants me to write about these extreme situations. And I do want to write about women, real women who existed, who did amazing things under terribly difficult circumstances. So I am currently seeking my next topic.
Well, you can combine those two, because war and women doing extraordinary things goes together. So it'd be interesting to see, what your next novel is, because your last 2 have been a really fantastic read. If anybody wanted to find out more about your work and, get your book, where do they go?
Well, the book is available, as they say, in all good bookshops. It's available, at all independent bookshops, Waterstones, online, all of that. There is my website, which is www.Maggie Brookes. Don't forget, I'm Maggie Brookes as the writer of the novel, and I'm also on Twitter as Maggie Brookes and on Facebook. So do get in contact, do read the book. I'd be very happy to hear what you think about it.
Well, thank you. I mean, I hope people do, and I'm sure many will, because I think your first book sold very well, and you've had it translated, I think, into several languages, and you certainly launched this second book really well. So I hope people will read it, because it is a very, very good book, and it was one of the advantages, I guess, of lockdown that allowed you to do it in record time. So, thank you for doing the interview again, and we'll do a third interview once your third book comes out, which I hope it comes out soon, but not, I hope we get locked down again, but I hope your book comes out soon. So thank you,
Thank you very much, Francis. It's been a huge pleasure talking to you about it.
Okay, well, thank you, and we'll end this interview now.